Bashar Hafez al-Assad was born on September 11, 1965, in Damascus, Syria, into the influential Assad family. He was the second son of Hafez al-Assad, a military officer who later became the president of Syria, and Anisa Makhlouf, who came from a wealthy and powerful family that played a significant role in the Syrian elite. Bashar grew up in a household shaped by politics, power, and authority. His father Hafez was a member of the Ba'ath Party, and by the time Bashar was a child, Hafez had already been consolidating his control over Syria, ruling the country as president from 1971 onward. Bashar was not initially expected to become the political heir of the family, as that role was intended for his elder brother Bashar al-Assad, who was being groomed for leadership from a young age. Bashar received his primary and secondary education in Damascus. Unlike his older brother, he was quiet, reserved, and had little interest in politics or military affairs during his youth. He pursued studies in medicine and enrolled at the University of Damascus, where he studied ophthalmology. After completing his degree, he began working as a doctor at the Tishreen Military Hospital in Damascus. Later, in 1992, he traveled to London to continue his medical specialization at the Western Eye Hospital. In London, he lived a relatively modest life compared to the image of political families in the Middle East. He was known to be soft-spoken, shy, and focused on his medical career. Bashar's future appeared to be in medicine, far away from the intense political and military life of Syria. However, the trajectory of his life changed in 1994 when his elder brother Bashar al-Assad died in a car accident. Bashar had been groomed as the heir to their father Hafez and was popular among the Syrian elite and military. His death left a vacuum, and attention turned to Bashar as the next possible successor. Bashar returned to Syria and began military training at the Homs Military Academy. Despite his background in medicine, he was thrust into the world of politics, gradually taking on more visible roles in Syrian society. Hafez al-Assad began preparing him for leadership, introducing him to the inner workings of the Ba'ath Party, the armed forces, and the intelligence agencies that formed the backbone of Syrian rule. Over time, Bashar was promoted through military ranks and started to appear in public ceremonies, projecting the image of a capable successor. When Hafez al-Assad died on June 10, 2000, the path was clear for Bashar to succeed him. The Syrian parliament swiftly amended the constitution to lower the minimum age for the presidency from 40 to 34, allowing the then 34-year-old Bashar to assume power. On July 17, 2000, he was inaugurated as the president of Syria after winning a referendum that officially reported near total support for him. Many Syrians and outside observers initially hoped that Bashar would bring reform and modernization to Syria. His youth, Western education, and reputation for being less rigid than his father created expectations for political openness and economic progress. In the early years of his rule, Bashar did indeed signal some reformist tendencies. The period that followed his rise was referred to as the Damascus Spring. Intellectuals, journalists, and activists began to meet and discuss political change, calling for democratic reforms, freedom of expression, and reduced repression. For a brief period, there was a sense of cautious optimism. However, this openness did not last long. By 2001, the regime cracked down on dissent, arresting activists and shutting down forums. It became clear that Bashar, despite his initial image, would continue the authoritarian system built by his father. The Ba'ath Party retained absolute control, the intelligence services continued their dominance, and political opposition was tightly suppressed. Economically, Bashar attempted to modernize Syria by introducing some elements of market reform. He encouraged private investment, liberalized parts of the economy, and sought foreign partnerships. This brought modest growth, especially in urban centers like Damascus and Aleppo, and a new business elite began to emerge. However, corruption remained rampant, and much of the economic benefit flowed to those connected to the regime, including members of the Assad and Makhlouf families. Rami Makhlouf, Bashar's cousin, became one of the richest men in Syria, controlling vast sectors of the economy from telecommunications to real estate. These moves deepened resentment among ordinary Syrians, many of whom saw inequality growing as the ruling elite enriched themselves. Bashar's foreign policy in the early years continued Syria's long-standing positions. He maintained a firm stance against Israel, demanded the return of the Golan Heights, and continued support for Hezbollah in Lebanon and Palestinian militant groups. Relations with the United States and Europe were mixed. At first, Western leaders were willing to engage with him, viewing him as a possible reformer. However, tensions grew over Syria's involvement in Lebanon, its role in supporting resistance groups, and later its alleged involvement in the 2005 assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. International suspicion and pressure increased, pushing Syria further into isolation. A turning point came in 2011, when the Arab Spring uprisings swept across the Middle East. In March of that year, protests erupted in the southern city of Daraa after the arrest and torture of teenagers accused of painting anti-regime graffiti. The demonstrations quickly spread, with people demanding political reforms, freedom, and an end to corruption and repression. Initially, Bashar al-Assad delivered speeches that suggested he understood the grievances, but his government chose to respond with violence. Security forces fired on protesters, leading to deaths that only fueled more anger. What began as peaceful demonstrations turned into a nationwide uprising. By the end of 2011, Syria had descended into a brutal civil war. As the conflict escalated, Bashar al-Assad deployed the full force of the Syrian military and intelligence apparatus against opposition groups. Cities such as Homs, Aleppo, and Hama became battlegrounds. The regime used artillery, airstrikes, and siege tactics to crush opposition strongholds. Human rights organizations accused the government of widespread atrocities, including torture, mass arrests, and indiscriminate attacks on civilians. One of the most controversial moments came in 2013, when chemical weapons were used in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta, killing hundreds. Western governments and opposition groups accused Assad's forces of carrying out the attack, while the Syrian government denied responsibility and blamed rebel groups. The incident drew international outrage and led to a US-Russian brokered deal for Syria to declare and dismantle its chemical weapons stockpile. Despite international condemnation, Bashar al-Assad remained in power, thanks to strong internal support from loyalist communities, the backing of his powerful security services, and crucial alliances abroad. Iran and Hezbollah provided fighters, money, and weapons, while Russia gave diplomatic and later military support. In 2015, Russia launched a direct military intervention, conducting airstrikes against opposition groups and bolstering Assad's forces. This intervention significantly shifted the balance of the war in his favor. By retaking key cities and regaining control over large parts of the country, Assad consolidated his position as the dominant force in Syria. Bashar al-Assad entered the second decade of his rule with the image of a leader who had kept his grip on a fragile nation, but the spring of 2011 changed everything. The unrest began in the southern city of Daraa, when teenagers who had written slogans inspired by revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt were arrested and allegedly tortured by security forces. Protests demanding their release grew quickly, and soon demonstrations spread across cities like Homs, Hama, and Damascus. At first, there were calls for reforms and political freedoms, but as violence escalated, the demands shifted towards the removal of Assad. His government responded with force, sending security units and the army to crush the demonstrations. While some believe Assad tried to announce reforms, such as lifting the long-standing emergency law and granting limited political concessions, these steps were overshadowed by widespread reports of killings, arrests, and crackdowns. By mid-2011, the situation spiraled into an armed conflict. Soldiers defected and formed the Free Syrian Army, while many opposition groups came together under various banners. Assad insisted he was fighting foreign-backed terrorists, while many Syrians saw it as a popular uprising against decades of authoritarian rule. International reactions were deeply divided. Western governments, including the United States and European Union, imposed sanctions on Assad and his family, targeting his financial networks and restricting Syrian oil exports. Turkey, which once had close relations with him, turned against him and supported the opposition. At the same time, Russia and Iran stood firmly by his side, supplying weapons, financial aid, and later direct military involvement. This marked the beginning of one of the most devastating wars of the modern era. The Syrian Civil War became a multi-sided conflict. Assad commanded loyal army units, elite Republican Guard forces, and intelligence agencies. He relied heavily on his inner circle, many of whom came from the Alawite minority community. As battles raged, the government deployed artillery, tanks, and later air power against opposition-held cities. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, with Homs and Aleppo becoming symbols of destruction. Human rights groups accused Assad of mass killings, arbitrary detentions, and even chemical weapon attacks. The use of sarin gas in Ghouta in 2013 drew global outrage. While Assad denied responsibility and blamed rebels, United Nations investigations pointed to regime forces. Under pressure, Assad agreed to dismantle Syria's chemical arsenal in a deal brokered by Russia and the United States, but later reports suggested further chemical attacks occurred in the years that followed. Despite immense international criticism, Assad managed to hold onto power. This was largely due to the decisive intervention of allies. Iran sent Revolutionary Guard advisors, weapons, and trained militias, including Hezbollah from Lebanon, to fight alongside Syrian forces. In 2015, Russia launched a large-scale air campaign, providing Assad with crucial support that turned the tide of the war. Russian jets bombed opposition positions, while the Syrian army, backed by foreign militias, regained lost territories. By the late 2010s, Assad had re-established control over most major cities, though large parts of the north and east remained outside his authority, controlled by Kurdish forces or opposition factions. The war brought catastrophic consequences. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians were killed, and millions were displaced, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Cities that once flourished with trade, culture, and history were left in ruins. International organizations accused Assad of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and targeting civilians deliberately. His government rejected these accusations and framed the conflict as a struggle against extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and later the Islamic State. The emergence of the Islamic State, which seized large territories in Syria and Iraq, complicated the war further. Assad presented himself as a bulwark against terrorism, which gained him reluctant acceptance from some international actors who prioritized defeating the Islamic State. Domestically, Assad tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in areas under his control. State media portrayed him as a defender of the nation, a leader who would not bow to foreign conspiracies. Elections were held in 2014 and again in 2021, both of which he won by overwhelming margins, though critics and international observers dismissed them as neither free nor fair. The constitution was altered to secure his presidency for years to come. Supporters argued that he provided stability and protected minorities in a country that could otherwise fall into extremist rule. Critics insisted that he had destroyed his own nation to cling to power. The economic consequences of the war were devastating. Syria's economy collapsed under the weight of destruction, sanctions, and corruption. Infrastructure, oil fields, and industries were largely destroyed. The Syrian pound lost much of its value, causing widespread poverty and shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. Allegations of corruption within the ruling elite grew louder, with Assad's family members and close allies accused of profiting from the chaos. In particular, his cousin Rami Makhlouf, once one of Syria's wealthiest businessmen, fell out of favor in a public feud, showing cracks within the inner circle. Internationally, Assad remained a deeply polarizing figure. Western powers continued to view him as illegitimate and held him responsible for mass atrocities. On the other hand, Russia and Iran promoted him as the legitimate president of Syria. Over time, some Arab states began re-engaging with Assad, seeing him as a permanent fixture who had survived attempts to overthrow him. By 2023, Syria was gradually being welcomed back into regional organizations like the Arab League, despite ongoing criticism from human rights groups. Assad's personal image was also shaped by contrasts. Supporters described him as calm, soft-spoken, and calculated, a man who inherited power unexpectedly yet adapted to survive the fiercest of storms. Detractors saw him as ruthless, willing to unleash untold destruction on his own people rather than step aside. His speeches often emphasized sovereignty, resistance to Western pressure, and the narrative of fighting terrorism. His life became a symbol of both resilience and tragedy, reflecting a ruler who managed to hold power against overwhelming odds but at an immense cost to his nation. As of today, Bashar al-Assad remains in power, presiding over a fractured Syria where his authority is still contested in the north and east, but where the central government continues to function under his command. His survival in office has made him one of the longest-serving leaders in the Middle East. The full judgment on his rule will likely be written by history, weighed between the image of a leader who endured relentless challenges and the accusations of a dictator who oversaw one of the bloodiest conflicts of the century. What remains undeniable is that his life and rule have left a deep imprint not only on Syria but on global politics, reshaping alliances, igniting humanitarian debates, and reminding the world of the devastating cost of unchecked power and civil war.